This video is all about the theory of backups and how you should build your deck thinking about your backup line. I know what everybody's thinking, there aren't enough videos out there that include some maths. So if you're one of those people, this video is for you. But don't worry, I've tried to keep it simple. So what are we going to look at? Well, as I said, we'll look about the theory of choosing what backup line to include in your deck, and in particular, how many backups should we have in total, and how many of those should be odd costed. Most decks look to play one backup that is a net 2 CP on turn 1 and then pass. What do we mean by net 2 CP? Well, it could be a backup that costs 1 CP or 2 CP, like these. It could cost 3 CP or 4 CP, but it will add a card to your hand either by searching or looking at the top number of cards of your deck or adding something back from the break zone. Or it could cost 5 or 6 CP, but it will add 2 cards to your hand in the same way. Or, in the case of Fat Chocobo, play another backup onto your field. So how many backups should you include? Well, it depends on how much risk you're willing to take. Let's call the backups that are net 2 CP turn 1 backups. And let's assume that you're going first because, for the majority of decks, it's more advantageous to do so. The table shows the probabilities. They improve slightly if you're going second because you'll see an extra card on your first draw. If you want to win a tournament with 6 rounds of Swiss and a top cut of 8, then you'll need to play the 6 games in the Swiss part and between 6 and 9 games in the top cut, so somewhere between 12 and 15 games in total. So the question is, are you willing to risk at least one of those games having no backups on your first turn, depending on how you build your deck? The limit break cards have helped improve any bad starts that you might have, obviously depending on what elements you're using. So Leo, Luna Freya and Warrior of Light can help you dig to find another backup that you might not have drawn in your first 5 cards. Should you keep a starting hand with only one backup, or would it be better to mulligan? Firstly, let's deal with the scenario where you have a backup that can search another backup. You should always keep that, because that's the ideal start and why you built your deck to include those cards in the first place. You're guaranteed to have that backup and then search for another one either on the same turn or on your next turn. So let's move on to the scenario where you draw one backup but it isn't one that searches for another. Should you keep it or risk a mulligan? If you choose to keep that first 5 cards, then your chances of being able to play an odd costed backup on turn 2 would depend on how many are in your deck and how many you already had in hand, which would either be 1 because it was the one that you drew, or none at all because you had an even costed backup. And it would also depend on the chances of drawing another odd cost from your next 3 cards, 1 on your first turn and 2 on the turn afterwards. So this table shows you what those odds look like. You can see that they're not great. So the question is, what if we choose to mulligan instead? Will we have a better chance of the start that we want? i.e. playing a backup on the first turn and then having an odd costed backup on the second turn. If you did mulligan, you'll draw a new set of 5 cards and you know that there's only one backup that you won't be able to draw from those because you'll have put it to the bottom in those first 5 cards. So your odds end up looking like this. It's important to understand your deck's composition so that you can gauge the risk and reward of a mulligan. The mulligan option looks better the more backups that you have in your deck, and also the more odd costed backups you have as well. Personally, I would always opt for the mulligan option. If you choose to keep those first 5 cards, then the next 3 that you draw into would have been part of your mulligan anyway, assuming that the turn 1 you do doesn't then search, which makes you shuffle your deck. So I would prefer to dig further into my deck from a mulligan to try and find the other backups that I want. But everybody's different. So how many odd costed backups should you include in the deck? Well, let's assume we're going first again and that we want to play one backup on turn 1 that's net 2 CP. And then let's assume we're playing a deck that wants to get to several backups before we start playing our forwards. So we want an odd costed backup to play on turn 2 that we can pay more efficiently by tapping that backup that we did on the first turn. So we either need to start with 2 backups in our first 5 cards, or we mulligan and then draw into them within the first 2 turns. So we could have 1 backup on turn 1, and then within those draws we see the odd costed backup, for example. So what are the probabilities of this happening? For mono element decks, the calculations are a lot easier, and that's what the figures I'm going to show you are based on. For multi-element decks that are roughly 50-50 split between the 2 elements, if there was 2 that is, you need to add on about 1 or 2% to the numbers. So I'm not bothering going down that route because I think it just overcomplicates things. Another thing to point out is that if your deck includes a backup that searches an odd costed backup, such as Claris that searches Epitaph, then a good start would include playing a different backup on turn 1, and then you could play both of those things the turn after, because you could pay an even amount for the searcher, find the target, and then tap your backup to play that target. Therefore, we can consider the number of odd costed backups in your deck to include the searchers themselves, even though they might not be odd costed. For example, if you have a mono earth backup line that looks something like this, it has 14 turn 1 backups plus the 2 Shantotto, which doesn't really count as a backup because we only ever want to play it reactively to clear a board rather than as part of our setup process. We have 5 backups that are actually odd costed, which are the 3 Black Belt, an Epitaph and Iridia. But we also have Claris that searches Epitaph. So in effect, we've got 8 backups that are odd costed to be able to play on our turn 2. If we crunch all of the numbers for these various backup lines with the different numbers and how many odd costs there are, we end up with a table that looks something like this. What this table shows you is that it's more important to consider the number of odd costs in the backup line rather than the total number of backups itself. And what I mean by that is, if you look at one example, well, 2 examples to compare. So if your deck has 10 backups in total, but all of those 10 are odd costed, then your chance of drawing a turn 1 backup and then having another odd costed backup for turn 2 is 81.1% here. But if you compare that to a different setup, if you've got 14 backups in total, or turn 1 backups I should say, but only 5 of them are odd costed, your chance of drawing a turn 1 backup and then having an odd cost the turn after is only 76.7%. So even though your deck had more backups in total, you've actually got a worse chance of having the start you want than the deck that only had 10 backups. Last topic I wanted to talk about was to try to persuade you that the minor backup is risky. Minor reveals the top 5 cards of your deck, and you can add a backup from those 5 cards to your hand. But what are the chances that minor misses and then you've overpaid for something that's not giving you back a card? It depends on how many cards remain in your deck and how many of those are backups. So let's try and simplify things by assuming we're going first and we either play minor on turn 1 or we play a different backup first and then play minor on turn 2. Decks that include minor usually run between 17 and 19 backups in total, and in my opinion the odds aren't great, and I'll show you those in a moment. But I suppose you can make the same argument I used a moment ago, that if minor was to miss, you were going to draw into those cards anyway, so in effect you're in no worse off of a position. But it still doesn't feel great if you play this card and then you don't hit something. So here's what the probabilities actually look like. And I'll just leave them on screen. I mean, there's not a great deal to say. I just thought it was worth pointing this out, and then you can judge for yourself, are you happy with those odds? I suppose the key thing you could learn from this is to keep track of how many backups have you actually seen in those first few cards when you're intending to play the minor. The more you've already seen, then obviously that diminishes your chances. So having a sense of how much they're affected might help you decide whether it's better to just wait and play the minor later or just not bother at all because it's too risky. Okay, that's all from me. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you again.